Hillary Allen, it is so exciting to have you on the podcast today.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled.
Okay, you have just released your book, Out and Back,
Mhm.
and we were just briefly chatting before we started recording, and I know it's your recovery story, but to me it is so much more than a recovery story.
Yeah. So I know I'm so thankful that you recognize that. This book, I mean, yeah, it's basically it was my opportunity to kind of document my recovery, but more so from a mental perspective, because it was a huge life-changing event. Yeah, it was this, crazy accident I had, and just this incredible life-changing moment. And after that, there's these moments in life, I think, where we can pick out where things were different after that point. And this was certainly one of them. And I wanted to basically document it, but in a way that allowed me to heal as I kind of learned and grew and you know, just basically recovered from this incident. And yeah, that's kind of where the book came about.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm doing research right now around failure. And
Wow.
so I was doing an interview with someone yesterday about failure, and somehow we got on the crazy topic of Oprah. And the person interviewing was saying how much she loved Oprah. And she thinks that she loves Oprah because Oprah ultimately loves to teach, and whatever she learns, she has to take people along for the ride with her.
Mhm.
And I think that's why I loved your book so much, is
Yeah.
because you used this incredible learning experience to teach, which, all right, not only are you a runner, you are a teacher.
Yeah.
So can we
And
talk about that a little?
yeah, and I love that because yes, I mean, so first of all, I'm curious. I'm a very curious person. And so as you mentioned, I am a teacher. So I have a master's degree in neuroscience and physiology. And I've always been a scientist even before I was an athlete. And for me, the point at which even learning chemistry in undergraduate school, like the moment where I realized that I knew the information is where I could teach it to someone else. And so teaching has always been a really important thing for me, because it meant that not only do I understand the material, I understood it to the fact that I could actually explain it in a new and interesting way. So maybe someone else could then grasp that as well. And I felt like it was this really cool way to kind of create community. And so it was one of my favorite aspects of teaching, especially a subject like chemistry, because everyone comes into my chemistry class, like I taught at a small college, and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to take this class. Like it's boring. And then I just blow their minds with how interesting chemistry is by like applying it to like real world applications. And people are like, oh, I never thought of it that way. I'm like, yeah, science is cool. Like, let's go. um, and so I kind of took basically, I mean, it didn't come instantly, this injury. And I view challenges as opportunities. And even though they might not start that way, like learning opportunities for growth, I, I I always try to find opportunities in them. And even though I might not know what that is right away, like, the silver lining, sometimes I'm just like, oh my gosh, just give me a few days, give me a week, maybe give me a month, and I'll tell you what the silver lining is. But sometimes I'm annoyed with it. Like I don't want to find the hidden meaning because I'm like, struggling in the fact that like I'm changing and it's uncomfortable and I'm trying to learn and grow and I don't quite understand yet. But that doesn't mean that those opportunities aren't there. And I think it's one of the most valuable lessons that I've learned throughout this recovery period is that, from my accident, is that I'm a new person, and that doesn't come with a judgment. It just is. And I learned so much because I allowed myself the opportunity to, take those uncomfortable feelings, roll around with them, and like, learn something from them.
Yeah. And you and I are just talking, and we're talking about it, what you went through. Oh, an injury. And I don't want people to think like, oh, I just broke my ankle, or, like you fell 150 feet off a mountain.
Yeah. So, I mean, this might seem, like, wow, I could never relate to what you're going through. But I disagree, because I think that the most unifying experience that every human has in common
Mhm.
is struggle. And everyone struggles. Everyone has hardships. Everyone is dealing with something. And, there really is no comparison. There is really no degree, because how can I judge that my suffering or my struggle is any greater in magnitude than yours? Because I don't know what it's like for you.
Right.
And, someone, reflected back upon me, they don't know what it's like for me. So I think empathy is, the definition of empathy is pretty much impossible, because you cannot experience what someone else is experiencing. However, there's still sympathy. And I think that we all have that in common. And so regardless of my accident, like you said, I'm a competitive runner for the North Face. And I had this incredible accident during one of the races that I was running, and I fell 150 feet off of a cliff. It was a freak accident, like a rock fell as I was running on this ridge line. And at something that I'm very practiced and skilled at doing. So, and I was lucky to be alive. I, had broken 14 bones, was told that I would never run again. And so this is basically chapter 1 in my book.
Yeah. I have to tell you, like, I was out for a run while I was listening
Oh
to
no.
one, and you're like, no, I was running on pavement in my little neighborhood. Like, I'm in North Carolina. It's relatively flat compared to where you're used to running. And I'm like, you're really in detail talking about what happened. And I'm like, oh my God, this is really graphic in the beginning. So
Mhm.
for those that have a tough time, get through that first chapter, get through those first few pages, because
Yes.
there are so many nuggets
Mhm.
in that. Hillary, I mean, this book, I mean, as I was prepping for this interview, I mean, I'll just show you. I've got so much underlined, and I write notes.
I
I'm
love
one of those
that.
people that destroys a book when they read it. I
Perfect.
I write in the margins,
That's
but I'm
awesome.
like, I'm gonna be reading like half her book back to her in this interview.
And I welcome that, because I mean, I am also the same. I love writing, obviously, because I wrote a book. Like, writing is so cathartic. It's a way for us to put our thoughts down on paper. And so for me, like I said, chapter 1, it starts like quite graphically. It puts you in this, like, where I was, and basically in my running career, and then that fall. And but even if you can't relate to falling 150 feet off of a cliff, like, who can really? Like, I haven't met someone who's had my exact same experience. But to me, that doesn't matter. I want to use that as just a starting point for struggle. If there's been any time in your life where you felt like it was impossible and you didn't know the right way forward, or that if you even could get to, the next day or the next hour, like, human struggle can take so many different forms. And I wanted to use my experience through this injury and this recovery as almost evidence and an example of human resilience. And throughout the book, I just kind of go through my own struggles physically, but also more so mentally. And I just want to use that as an invitation for other people reading, to reflect on challenges that they're facing or have faced. And I think it's a really cool community that we can create if we just allow for that, shared struggling.
Hillary, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and when we have had points in our lives when we felt like struggling, I mean, we often use the term, it feels like the rug was pulled out from underneath us. So we might not be able to feel like, we might not know what it feels like to fall off a mountain, but I'm sure many of us who have been in that experience of suffering and having something tough know that feeling in the pit of our belly. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that there's so much that I want to talk to you about, but one of the first things that really, really struck me, aside from like what actually happened to you, was
Mm-hmm.
the way that you were talking about dependency and nakedness. How when you come home, and I mean, it sounded like both of your wrists were broken, so I don't know
Mm-hmm.
that you could feed yourself well.
Not very
And
well.
you can't walk, so you're in a wheelchair. And you were talking about how you had to have folks help you with
Mm-hmm.
almost everything, including like getting in the shower. But you said that for you, and I'm gonna read back to you your words. You said physical nakedness was fine, but my state of weakness and dependency made me feel exposed down to my core. Like the weakest part of me was on display under blinding fluorescent lights. It wasn't the shower that exposed me, it was the vulnerability of having to ask yet again for help getting dressed and undressed.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I use that analogy of like, standing naked in the light full of fluorescent, full of fluorescent lights, just because it's just that, you can't see where the judgment is coming from, but it's there and it's blinding and it's all around. That came from, and honestly, even to this day, it's hard asking for help. Um, I'm a very independent person, and sport and running was a way for me to express that independence and to feel full and fulfilled in my body and my strength. And then when I had that all taken away from me in a single moment, like that, rug being pulled out from under me, literally. I mean, it was a rock in my case, but still, um, you know, and then I had to ask for help from everyone. Like my injuries were extensive. I broke 14 bones. So, like you said, I had broken both wrists. I had hardware placed in them, so I wasn't able to lift more than like a Coke can or like a beer can. um, but just for reference of weight. So I couldn't cook. I really couldn't grasp my hands. So I had to basically like make some contraptions around my fork, like a styrofoam holder, so I could actually hold that and feed myself. But then, my right foot was broken. I had surgery on it. I couldn't use that. My left ankle was like super weak, so I could hardly hobble around on that. My back was broken, my ribs, like I was just this shell of a human, and physically speaking, but that brought about all of this emotional rawness when I had to ask for help.
Right.
And like you said, the physical nakedness, like, okay, like certainly people that I hardly knew well were like, basically chaperoning me in the shower, which, it's this one type of, vulnerability to have someone else wash your hair when you're naked in the shower because you can't use your own limbs. However, it's another type of vulnerability to then, once you have experienced that rawness, you also have to ask for help for getting dressed. And then once that's done, you have to ask for help cooking dinner. You have to ask for help being fed, cleaning up. I was just completely dependent. And I think previously I had associated that with weakness.
Hmm.
Um, and that's something that I had to change.
Yeah. Okay. So I think why this struck me so much, aside from what you just said, all of those reasons why it's real, is because um, I recently, within the last year, I wrote a blog post. I was a nude model. I have stood in front of a room naked under
Mm-hmm.
fluorescent lights
Mm-hmm.
for all of the flaws, right, to
Mm-hmm.
be seen. But I'm a coach, and I think that like I'm a not a running coach. I'm like a transitions resiliency coach,
Mm-hmm.
and what I think that what I ask people to do is harder. That I'm asking people to share true raw vulnerability,
Mm-hmm.
and so your example of it resonated so deeply with me. And then you go on to talk about how this accident stripped you of who you thought you were. And so then you're dealing with this emotional, like, who am I? What is life worth living for? Like literally you're asking yourself, you're share you you're grappling with, do I want to be alive questions
Mhm.
is what it sounds like.
Mhm.
And you talked about, you shared that with your community. Okay, so I see that as a huge strength. How did you know to do that?
Yeah, so honestly, it didn't come easily. Um, and for me, I don't think I found out through mistakes. Um, I think before I was literally faced with I didn't know what to do. I didn't know which way was up. I had was completely stripped of self. I was completely stripped of whatever identity that I had, given myself, all attached to what I could do and this quote unquote strong person that I was because I could, run and I was able bodied. And I could do it myself kind of mentality. But when that was all stripped away and I felt like I was left with nothing, I was asking this question of who am I? And I didn't know the answer. And it took time for me to work through that. And honestly, I made this, and I don't really know how I knew that this was the right path for me, but I had seen other people and other athletes struggle with injuries before, and I saw this narrative, and not just athletes, people. When they struggle with something, they become this kind of recluse, and they push away people that they care about, people that they love, the community. And I had been guilty of that in the past. I wouldn't let people see me when I was struggling. I would just keep that to myself. Like I thought that no one wanted to see it because I associated it with weakness.
Hmm.
But I told myself early on in the recovery that I needed to be honest with myself because this was unprecedented territory for me.
Hmm.
And I had never experienced these types of lows and these injuries and these feelings. And so I told myself that I needed to be honest with my recovery. I needed to be honest first with myself. And then that encouraged honesty within my community, within my immediate, like close friend group and my broader community of runners, scientists, friends, everyone. But it first started with honesty to myself. And that honesty looked like first me writing. So writing has always been cathartic for me. It's just a place where I can write down, the good, the bad, the super ugly, and no one can read it. First of all, because I have really bad handwriting, and second of all, it's just like it's safe. It's contained within the little neat little lines of my notebook, and I don't even have to go and reread it. It's just there, and it's safe, and it's out there. And the more I did that, the more when people asked me how I was, that I could no longer lie. I could not put on a happy face because sometimes I just literally all I could do was cry. And that honesty, first with myself of what I was feeling, it encouraged me to be that way authentically to other people that I cared about. And so the more I did that, the more I was able to share with people that I trusted and then, be honest with, brutally honest, with my community. And I felt like selfishly it was a way for me to help myself, like basically to kind of liberate the negative thoughts as a means for just letting them go, admitting that I don't have any power over them, but then turn that around and then they didn't have any power over me anymore
Hmm.
and I could just experience it. And yeah.
Do you think that's because you talk about how important integrity is to you? Like it's a core value for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that it was almost impossible not to share that because it would have been out of alignment with integrity to keep it to yourself?
Oh man, I love that. I mean, I feel like you get me now after reading the book because that's like it's like the best. I mean, integrity is like my core value. I think I define integrity as okay, like you're doing this no matter who's watching. And that's important. And to me, that's how I live my life. And I think it's like, it's just like if you ask these scientific questions and it's like, I'm the person who like literally can't contain her excitement and I have to like ask why. Like it's part of me. And so absolutely, I think it's like, even if I tried, I couldn't hold that part of me back. And so absolutely, it goes with this in integrity and this, I have this need and this desire, but just, yeah, this absolute need for me to be myself and be able to express that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I I mentioned to you I'm doing I'm doing personal research on failure. I'm trying to
Yeah.
write a book about it. And I've been interviewing people, and one of the really interesting things to me is I keep asking of like, after you experience failure, what is your process to make it so that
Mhm.
you don't sit in a place of inaction? And
Mhm.
so many people have said already community. And I was so fascinated in your book. Um, you talked about how, and I'm looking for where exactly you said it, but you talk about how, oh, you
Hmm.
said that the moment I realized how extraordinary it can be to accept help from someone, how it's not really about me at all. It's really about the process of giving help and receiving it. My community grew because I was in a place of need. Over time, I realized I was the only one who felt uncomfortable as the receiver of help. No one who helped me saw me as weak or insignificant, and none of them asked for anything in return.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's beautiful. And honestly, it's the first time in my adult life that I had really truly experienced that. And it all started, and it's extremely powerful and it's still persisted, since that moment. And I think really the difference is that I allowed for that to happen. Whereas before, I was actively trying to push it away because I was holding on to this independence, which, I thought naively, I thought that it was like what made me strong and like what made people like me, or, all of this stuff, when really it wasn't. It's like I discovered that intimacy and that connection with people through vulnerability.
Yeah.
And
I
that was like insane. I didn't even understand it.
So you writing that rocked me to my core, because in 2019 my dad passed away and I filed for bankruptcy, and I'm the oldest of three. So, and part of it was because I irresponsibly left the security of corporate America to found this business, and I talk about it a lot. I'm very public with it because I
Mhm,
think that's important.
mhm.
But something that I've never shared is that I had to ask my little sister for money. Like, and it was in that, I mean, I don't think I've ever felt so much shame in my whole life, but it gave my sister an opportunity to not only show that she could support me, but like to be her best self too. And I thought about it as I was reading from you. This part from you is like, when you received help and you allowed people to see you where you were actually giving them a gift too. And so it rocked me because I thought maybe I was giving a gift too in asking for help.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful because, and this is, I think, some another way that more people can, and I hope at least like relate to, is that, and it took me so long to realize it. Like really the not being able to accept help was coming from me because no one viewed me differently. And and I think about like the push and the pull. Like I love the sunrise. But I can't get there unless, we have darkness and a sunset. And so there's this beauty in kind of both sides, lightness and darkness. And what's dark for me is actually light for someone else. And it's just the nature of relationships is like, there's opportunities and you can't be on an even keel for forever. There's times when you give a little bit and that's beautiful because it makes you feel fulfilled. And there's other times when there's opportunities for others to help you, and it just builds this stronger foundation. Yeah, and it was the first time I was really able to experience it in a real way.
Hmm. Well, I Thank you for sharing it with us
Hmm.
in your book.
Yeah.
Um, you know, you also talk about how, all right, so you fall off a mountain, you end up being helevaced to a hospital, you have a set of surgeries, you end up then being sent back home to Colorado, and you have more surgeries in Colorado, and you go through, being in the wheelchair and in the boot, but you said that your recovery didn't begin until you were given the go ahead to walk. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I remember that moment distinctly. For starters, I no longer had the appearance of an injured person. So I didn't have my casts. I didn't have my scooter. And that was almost like a protection of, basically telling people that, okay, like I'm injured, like be careful, And once I had that
Physical
also,
armor.
right, it's literally armor. And so once I had that kind of stripped away from me, I was kind of just like, wait, what? Like I had to do a second take because that was like that what my scooter was how I was getting around. It was like my legs. Like so it was almost just this grieving period of like, okay, what do I do now without this literal like crutch here? But it was this epiphany moment because as soon as I was walking around like my first steps, I remember looking around. I'm just like, why isn't everyone like, why are people like not being careful around me? Like, what's happening? Don't they know that I've, just these are my first steps like that? Don't they know that I've been through this crazy experience? And I'm like, well, no, of course they don't. And then I reflected back and I'm like, but then I have no idea what everyone else is going through. And so at that moment, this is, how I explained just at the very beginning. It's like you don't have to fallen off of a 150-foot cliff to relate to what I'm going through. Everyone has something that they're dealing with. And you might not be able to tell because they don't have any physical indications that they are, but that doesn't mean that they're not struggling. And that I think is as best of an attempt at empathy that, anyone can ever get to. And that was just completely eye-opening for me. And it really shaped my recovery moving forward because in many ways I felt like those first steps were day one. Like that
Mhm.
was day one of survival because and now I have this whole big journey of okay, like now I can walk, but if I want, do I want to try to run again? Do I want to go down this path? And it's a pretty daunting path to, like start from zero in a new body that has metal in it and has changed and, the head attached to it is still pretty shook up from what had happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And I was cheering you on through the whole book.
I felt it. Thank you.
um, and along those lines, there is an area in the book where you write about how there is innate danger anytime we go out for a run, anytime we do something, and that that just because something from is familiar doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. And oftentimes it is the most familiar trails, the most familiar routes that are the most dangerous. Can you talk to me about how you reconciled that for yourself?
Yeah, so it's this conversation that I have with myself, a discussion really about risk. And what you just described is the kind of the innate risk that's just there. Um, when we decide to kind of go, at least for me, like in the mountains and on more technical terrain, like, if I'm alone or even with friends, like just out in nature. And there's just this risk because, things happen, right? It's like what happened to me. Sometimes you just can't control it. And that's never going away. And so I had to learn that, okay, well, if I want to return to running, how do I accept that? Do I want to accept it? Is it something I want to run away from? Is it something that I want to continue? Because it's not something I can change. It's part of just basically doing this thing that I love. And so how I managed it is basically that, like, I'm well aware of that there's an inherent risk. But what I can do on my side is I can practice these skills so that I'm comfortable accepting these risks. And then I can also focus on myself, and that if at any point I feel uncomfortable, then I can choose to not do the route that day.
Mm,
Or, basically becoming more in tune with the emotions that I'm feeling. Like if I'm feeling like not motivated to do
mm,
something, then I have the power to walk away. Like the mountains are going to be there tomorrow. And that is like putting more of the power within me and myself, and um telling myself that, okay, I get to make these decisions. And it's, purely on feeling, and if and wanting to do something. That's
mm.
really powerful. And for me, it made it easier to return back to this sport that is inherently dangerous, accept those risks because I love it that much. And I'm still not willing to die for it.
Right. Can you talk about, all right, so in my coaching world, something that we talk a lot about is something that you grapple with in the book. How do
Mhm.
you know when you have a gut knowing that you shouldn't do something? Like, how do you know if something is a true fear or an irrational fear?
Right. And this is something that I still struggle with, right? So for instance, like in getting back to running. I had this fear that I was going to fall, that I was going to happen again. And that fear would pop up to me even when I wasn't necessarily on a technical trail. So that to me was just this evidence that, okay, this is maybe an irrational fear, like from a trauma that might, not it might not go away for a while, but I have to learn to kind of quiet that voice. And then these other fears, which are there to actually tell you something.
Mm,
And that it's a gut feeling. I think it's like a lot of this like intuition, and it comes from knowing yourself well. And it's not out of, basically fear of failure or fear of embarrassment. Like, I can be afraid of the start line, of a race, for instance. And I'm not, I mean, fear of, failing, not doing well, or not, finishing to the expectations that I've laid before me. But that to me is not a big enough fear to not do the race.
hmm,
Now, what would be a fear is if I have this like lingering kind of feeling that maybe I was dealing with an injury, and that like doing this race probably isn't the best idea. That's like that deeper knowledge, and that knowing of oneself. I
mm,
think that can bring about these fears that are out of more of like intuition. And when going to the mountains, like for me, it's a little bit, I might not be able to hold on to it, or it might not be as black and white. But if there's at any time when I'm going on a long, you know, adventure that requires focus, and that requires an extreme wanting and motivation to do it, if I'm at all doubting my motivation, or, my internal feelings that day, that to me is an indication that that's not what I need to do that day.
mm,
And I think that those feelings are there because they are protective. If I'm already going into an adventure or a big day feeling kind of tired and apprehensive, if something were to happen, maybe it would be worse than if I came into it with a sharp mind, right? And so it's that kind of thing that I've been able to learn from and to recognize within myself. And I can only best describe it as that gut feeling that comes from honesty and
mm,
truly knowing yourself, and the motivation behind these endeavors that we have.
yeah. Okay. There is another piece of your book. I mean, I just can't even explain to you how over the moon I am for, I'm like gaga for your book, because it really made an impact on me. And
Thank you.
you mindset. Okay. I talk about mindset with my clients all the time. And I am so good at identifying when someone else has a mindset that needs to be changed. Okay. Right. Like I'm good at that. That's what people pay me to do.
Mhm.
Now, I have a really hard time shining that light back on myself.
Mm-hmm.
But a couple things were happening for me simultaneously. My boyfriend was talking about something, and I was like, oh, that's a mindset thing. A friend that I was working with, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a mindset thing. And then I'm reading your book, and you, in your book, one of the things that you wrote out for yourself in the beginning was that you believed your best running days were ahead of you.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote that down after being told that you would probably not run again. And that's what you like, and seeing that and finishing your book made me realize that there was something for me in that as well, and that like there's a belief that I hold around my business and my work that I had to change, that it's time for me to see my, like, other people won't see me as the professional that I am until I see myself as the professional that I am. And so I wrote out a whole list of affirmations that I needed to start saying to myself after reading your book. How did you know to do that?
Oh, that's amazing. That's like one of my favorite chapters. It's like believe, or belief. And like I said, writing has always been this sanctuary for me. And it was one of the few things I could do early on. And I don't even think I knew what I was doing. A good friend of mine at the time, Alan Lim, he's the co-founder of Scratch Labs, this nutrition company in
I have
Boulder.
his book.
Oh, he's wonderful. I have his book right here too. And so he's been a good friend of mine, and he kind of guided me in this too, of just like encouraging that in me, to like encourage the writing. And like had my journal at this coffee shop that's by his house. It's one of my favorite coffee shops. And he was meeting me for coffee one day there, and he saw my journal, and he kind of asked me about it, and was talking about affirmations and how I was like kind of writing these things and like these themes. And he kind of wrote down a few that worked for him in my journal, and I kind of dog-eared it and went back. And so then it encouraged me to kind of write some more down of these kind of like long form thoughts. And this is one that came out of it, because I was really struggling with this idea of, okay, like I don't even know where to start with recovery, and I don't even know if I want to do this anymore. And yeah, so that was something that I came up with. And I think you can, mine was believe that your best athletic days are ahead of you. But it can just be simplified to believe that your best days are ahead of you. And it's beautiful because it's timeless. And I think we have this negative connotation with aging and in our culture, and also just with change. And to me, I think change is beautiful because it's the only constant in life. And it's the one thing that can actually make you better and different. And change is awesome. And it doesn't mean it's not difficult. But believing that your best days are ahead of you is just something, honestly, I would write it down every day. And it was a belief that I always had, but writing it down made it real. And even though every day I don't think I believed it, some days I thought it was rather silly. Um, but it was even more important for me to write them down on those days.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that nugget because I'll be using it a lot for myself, and I'm sure with clients too. But
I love it.
yeah. So you it's not till the end of the book, towards the end of the book, that you share that you have grappled with disordered eating.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think you talked about that in the process of recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And I too have just grappled with that thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And first I was like, damn it. We got this far in the book. I'm like, maybe she's one of the athletes that hasn't had to struggle with this. And then I was like, no, damn it. She had to deal with this too. So that was kind of like the first thing, because it's like I don't wish it on any of us. but there was a part where I was like, preach, fuck this shit. I wrote that in the book. I said,
Yes.
you said, when did it become acceptable for eating to be shameful? For an athlete to be criticized for her appearance rather than applauded for her accomplishments? When did it become okay to starve yourself after a workout instead of nourishing and replenishing yourself to feel full and happy? When did it become okay for women to celebrate losing their periods because they've trained so hard, or become so rail thin that a hard training week might push them over the edge into chronic fatigue or cause a stress fracture? Sorry, this is just so powerful. When did the number of abs or ribs you concede indicate your finishing time, or if you are more likely to get a podium spot? These are questions I ask myself to deliver perspective, to be in touch with reality. Whew, Hillary.
And I think that I cried when I was writing that. Because this is, like I said, it's far more of a story of, recovery. It's a call to action, and writing that piece in this book was hard for me because I felt that I spent so much time as an athlete being critical of my body, being angry at it if it didn't perform a certain way, or I was disappointed in a time, or, comparing myself to other people, specifically other women. And writing this story and being honest about my struggles with an eating disorder in college, and basically how I discovered running, and it was a way of healing because it was a way of celebrating my strength and my power. And then to be faced with, negative, basically negative criticism, with how I would look, like you just read, and not, measured in my performance, but of how I looked and how I didn't fit a certain mold, literally.
Yeah, like you had talked about, you had just like, I don't know if you'd won or come in second. Like, I think you'd
Hmm.
won a really, really hard race. And someone was like, how much do you weigh? Like compared
Right.
to the person that like came in behind you.
Hmm.
And someone
It,
you had beat, like he was probably trying to poke you down in any way he could because of his insecurity. But like, when is it okay for that ever to be said to somebody?
and so again, yeah, like that and writing again was a way for me to put it on paper and be like, this is not okay. And, as for someone who struggled with an eating disorder, that is enough to like raise thoughts and doubts. And, even though I was recovered at that point and I had other coping mechanisms like writing, it's still very hard. And that you ask these questions that are really painful. And I just wanted to write this piece in the book to prove that, okay, yeah, like I may have struggled with it too. And there's a way through, and there's a way around it, and there's a way to still acknowledge those ugly feelings, but then also, challenge them. And I want to be the person that's challenging them and raising these conversations within the greater community of not just women in sport, but women in general. And this idea that we have to fit a certain mold in order to, you know, to fit a certain definition of what, others, have decided that, is beautiful.
Right.
And it was also a way for me to celebrate my body, and that it had, in fact, my strength and like physical strength, but also just, that's what saved my life that day on that mountainside.
That you
And
were strong and you were healthy and
mhm,
like you had nourished yourself.
mhm. Yeah. And if I had done anything else, I probably wouldn't be here. And it's taken me a while to get to that point. Like I said, I had struggled in college, and I didn't start running professionally till I was, 25. So this is on the order of years, of practicing that positive self-talk, and that, that honesty, and so I came from it at a place, but it's just like my accident. It's a time in my life that will always define me and leave its mark, but it's there to learn from, and it's, what I want to do with it today. And I hope that, me writing this chapter and being honest about that part of my life will encourage other women to challenge that idea in their own lives and, whatever capacity that they're struggling in it with. Yeah.
Well, I'm sad that you had to experience that. And I am grateful that you were willing to write about it and share it in this, because I think we are getting a little bit better at talking about it, but
Mhm.
I don't think we're good enough yet at talking about it, especially how prevalent it is
Mhm.
for all women, but especially women athletes.
Yeah.
Um, and so thank you. Thank you for sharing that part of your story. It's important.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing it up because I think it's something that we should talk about more. So.
Yeah. Um, there's so much I want to ask you about, and I don't want to give away the whole book because I want people to go out and read it. Pick it up, read it, get it. But you talk about injuries are painful in the way they illuminate the areas in your life where improvement or change is necessary. I feel like that is the theme of the whole book, isn't it?
Mhm. Yeah, and that doesn't mean and it's actually so easy. I feel it's like you can read that one way of like, oh man, it puts a magnifying glass. It's like this is where you suck and you need to change. But no, it's more of like kind of it's just more of a gentle encouragement, maybe sometimes abrupt. We're not expecting it, but absolutely. And it's for me, it's all about a perspective shift.
Hmm.
It's not viewing it as like, oh my gosh, this is closing a door, but rather it's okay, like how many doors are now open because this happened.
Mm. Yeah, that what a beautiful way to look at it. Trying to think.
Mm.
Um, so I'm a lay athlete, and it's only very recently that I'm even willing to call myself an athlete. I never considered, like, it's only been recently. I'm a
Hmm.
lay athlete. If I injure myself, no big deal. I take some time off, and that's that. I mean, you're a professional athlete. You're sponsored by North Face, and
Mhm.
um, this is like your career, as well as a part of your career, as well as a part of who you are intrinsically. What is that like, to be sponsored and then have such a devastating injury? Like, what did that portion of it bring up for you?
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's hard to summarize, but the one thing I can say is that it was this complete loss of self. I felt because not only is running something I love dearly, it's a way I love to explore the world. It's a way that I love to explore myself. Um, and then it's also a career. And
Hmm.
so then having that taken from me, I felt at such a loss. I felt this immense grief and sadness from this trauma, and I didn't know who I was.
Hmm.
And so I felt empty. I felt like this shell of who I was, and I didn't know how to fill myself back up again.
Hmm.
And that persisted for a while. But it was necessary to experience that because it allowed me not only to fall in love with running again, but in a completely new way that was separate from competition. And I didn't need to go back to elite level racing. I didn't need that. It would be just a benefit. And but there was just this liberty that I get to just explore, and then I got to define myself how I wanted to, and to feed those different aspects of me, and realize that it was so naive to define myself in only one dimension because it's impossible. I'm not a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And, and so it was just allowing myself to encourage those other things that made me feel like a full person. And that doesn't mean that running, I've been injured since that accident, and it doesn't mean that any injury gets easier. Running is something that I truly love. And so when it's taken away from me, there is that grief and loss, but I still have the different resources that, I can reach for, and that I know who I am outside of running. And I know also that I love running. But that's not the only thing that makes me me.
Yeah. Well, your love of running is contagious. I put down your book after I finished it, and I immediately texted my boyfriend, and I'm like, I think I'm gonna sign up for an ultra.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Which it's always been in the back of my head. And then after reading your book, I was like, this might be the year of the ultra. We have one here in Greensboro that happens in October, and I've always done the heavy half.
Nice.
And I was like, nope, this is the year. This is the year I try for the ultra.
Wait, which race is this?
It's
So, because I've been to North Carolina, I think I've been to Greensboro. I did the Quest for the Crest 50K.
okay. It wasn't that.
That was a hard race. It was like
I don't know why I'm blanking on the name of this race.
It's so beautiful. That area is incredibly beautiful.
Come back.
Okay.
So thank you. You've definitely inspired me in so many ways, but definitely to expand my running horizons. What else would you like us to know right now?
I just think, like I said, it's just view challenges as an invitation to that it's not impossible, an invitation to think beyond, these boundaries that we hold for ourselves, and that they're just opportunities to become better and to learn about these, I don't know, the strength that you already have. I think that's the coolest part that I found out through the accident, is that, I was stronger than I thought I was. And strength isn't what I thought it was. Like, strength isn't this physical attribute. It's more of this depth to be able to recognize when you need help and ask for it. And really the strength in vulnerability. And I think that is the biggest gift that I was able to learn, is that being vulnerable, it's difficult, but it is the strongest way that I could show up for myself and others.
And that is a hard one gift. And the last question we ask here at Yoke in Abundance is, how do you live a life of abundance?
Oh man, that's such a good question. How do I live a life of abundance? This is maybe not going to be the answer you're looking for, but I describe myself as a walking contradiction. I'm full of ands. Yes, and also. So this is how I live a life of abundance, is that I want to say yes, and I want to define myself with a series of ands, because I don't like to use the word but, because I feel like it excludes what comes before it. So, for example, if I'm feeling this way, I feel angry, and I'm happy that I'm showing up for myself today. And that can be applied to anything. And, I'm an athlete for the North Face, and I'm a scientist, and now I'm an author. I'm also a coach. All of these things that can lead to abundance. And that's in the things we do, but it's also in how we feel. I think emotions of grief can also exist with happiness and gratefulness. And so it's just allowing more room for all of the messy, and not having it be, having it be excluded, but having it exist together. And so I describe that as my and also Hillary.
I love it. Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much.